The eviction notice was stapled to my door, not taped, because whoever delivered it clearly wanted it to survive the wind coming off Lake Ontario that morning. I stood in the hallway of my building in Hamilton in my socks, coffee going cold in my hand, reading the same paragraph 4 times like it might rearrange itself into better news. 10 days. 10 days before the sheriff's office would have the legal right to change my locks. My name doesn't matter as much as what happened that month, but I'll tell you anyway. I'm Owen Madison, 29 years old, and 6 months earlier I'd been a project coordinator at a mid-sized logistics company near the port. Decent salary, benefits, the whole boring, stable life I never thought to be grateful for until it disappeared. The company lost its biggest shipping contract to an outfit in Vancouver, and within 8 weeks, they laid off almost half the office, me included. I remember my manager couldn't even look at me when she said it. She just kept staring at her keyboard like the words were typed there for her to read off. If you believe people can surprise you when you least expect it, go ahead and hit like on this one. Drop a comment, maybe subscribe while you're at it. I've got a story I think you'll want to sit with for a while. Severance ran out faster than I budgeted for. Rent in Hamilton wasn't Toronto money, but it still ate through what I had left within 4 months, especially once I started dipping into savings to cover groceries and the gas bill in February, which is brutal here if you've ever lived through an Ontario winter. I applied everywhere. Warehouses, delivery routes, 2 other logistics firms that never called back, even a stint trying to get hired at a hardware store on Barton Street that ended with the manager telling me I was overqualified, which is a polite way of saying no. By the time the notice showed up, I was already behind 2 months on rent, with a landlord who'd been patient right up until he wasn't. I couldn't blame him. He had his own bills. But understanding that didn't make the red letters on the page any less terrifying. My apartment was small, the kind of 1-bedroom that real estate listings call cozy, because tiny doesn't sell. Radiator that clanked at 3 in the morning like it was trying to communicate. A window that looked out onto a parking lot and, if you stood at just the right angle, a sliver of the escarpment in the distance. I'd lived there for 2.5 years. It wasn't much, but it was mine, or it had been. The shame hit harder than the fear, if I'm honest. Fear, I could manage. Fear just makes you move, makes you send out another 20 applications, makes you check your bank balance obsessively like watching it might change something. But shame sits in your chest and doesn't leave. I started avoiding the building superintendent in the lobby. I'd time my trips to the mailbox for when I figured nobody else would be around. I imagined every neighbor already knew, already had an opinion about the guy in 4B who couldn't keep it together. By day 6, I'd started putting things in boxes. Not because I'd given up exactly, but because some practical part of my brain had quietly accepted what the optimistic part refused to. I was folding a stack of old t-shirts into a milk crate I'd grabbed from behind the grocery store when there was a knock at my door. Soft, almost apologetic, the way you knock when you're not sure you should be knocking at all. I opened it expecting the super, or maybe a notice from the sheriff's office, moving things along faster than expected. Instead, I found my landlady standing there, a woman I'd really only ever dealt with through email and the occasional maintenance request. Her name was Eleanor Pruitt. She was somewhere in her early 60s, silver-streaked hair pulled back, wearing a wool coat, even though she'd clearly just come from somewhere indoors, like she'd thrown it on in a hurry. She owned 3 buildings in the neighborhood, including mine, though I'd maybe spoken to her face-to-face twice in 2.5 years. My stomach dropped immediately. I figured she was there to tell me herself, in person, that the eviction was moving forward. Maybe to ask when I'd be fully out. I started apologizing before she'd even said a word, the kind of reflexive sorry you say when you're bracing for the worst. She held up a hand, gently, and asked if she could come in. Her eyes moved past me into the apartment, the half-packed boxes stacked by the door, the bare walls where I'd already taken down picture frames, the general disarray of a life being folded up small enough to fit somewhere else. She didn't say anything about it. She just stepped inside and closed the door behind her, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The radiator clanked once, like it wanted in on the conversation too. Then she told me she'd seen the eviction file that morning. She'd been away in Halifax visiting her brother for almost 3 weeks, and had only just gotten back to the property management paperwork that had piled up in her absence. She said something about my file didn't sit right with her, not the late payments themselves. She'd seen plenty of those in 20 years of owning property, but something in the pattern of it. The way the payments had been steady for 2 years, and then just stopped all at once. She asked me to tell her what happened. I hesitated, because pride doesn't disappear just because you're broke. It actually gets louder sometimes, like it's compensating. But there was something about how she waited, not impatient, not performing sympathy, just genuinely present, that made it easier to talk than I expected. I told her about the layoff, about the logistics company losing the Vancouver contract, about the rejection emails that all started sounding the same after a while, about lying awake doing math in my head that never worked out no matter how many times I ran it. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly, like she'd already half suspected the shape of the story before I told it. What she said next wasn't what I expected. It wasn't an offer to waive a month's rent, or set up a payment plan, which honestly would have already felt like more than I deserved. Instead, she told me something about herself I'd had no idea about. Before she ever got into real estate, Eleanor had spent almost 15 years running employment support programs out of a community organization in Hamilton's East End, helping people coming out of layoffs, out of injuries, out of long stretches of unemployment find their footing again. She'd stepped away from it when her husband got sick, and after he passed, she'd put her energy into the buildings instead, because it was simpler, less emotionally costly. But lately, she said, she'd been thinking about going back to that kind of work. She'd bought a vacant unit on Ottawa Street, ground floor, that used to be a laundromat, and she'd been sitting on the idea of turning it into something useful without quite knowing how to start, or who to start it with. Then she looked at me directly and made her offer. She told me she'd cancel the eviction, and she'd let me stay in the apartment without rent for the next 3 months, while I got back on my feet. In return, she wanted my help turning that empty laundromat into a job resource center. Resume help, interview prep, connections to local employers, the kind of practical support she used to provide years ago. I actually laughed a little, not because it was funny, but because it was so far outside anything I'd braced myself for that my brain didn't know what else to do with it. I told her I barely had my own life figured out, that I didn't see how I was qualified to help anybody else with theirs. She just looked at me with this calm, steady patience, and said that the people who understand what it feels like to lose everything are sometimes exactly the people who know how to help someone else hold on to something. The next few weeks didn't feel like my life anymore, not the one I'd been living for the past 6 months anyway. Instead of waking up already exhausted from dread, I woke up with somewhere to be. Eleanor and I spent long days at the old laundromat, ripping out the broken dryers, patching drywall, painting the walls a pale gray blue she picked out because she said it felt less like a waiting room. We scrounged secondhand desks from a furniture resale shop on King Street, borrowed folding chairs from her church, put out a call on a local Hamilton Facebook group for donated laptops, and people actually showed up with them, some still in working condition, some needing a trip to a repair shop. A guy named Marcus ran 2 blocks over, who fixed half of them for free once he heard what we were doing. People started coming in almost as soon as we put a hand-lettered sign in the window. A woman who'd worked at a call center that shut down overnight needed help building a resume that didn't make a 13-year gap look like a red flag. A man in his 50s who'd been a machinist for 2 decades before his plant moved operations to Mexico needed someone to walk him through online job applications, because the entire process had changed since the last time he'd needed to look for work. A 19-year-old kid who'd dropped out of a trades program needed someone to just tell him it wasn't too late to go back. Every single person who walked through that door reminded me of exactly where I'd been 3 weeks earlier. And every time someone left looking a little lighter than when they came in, something in me started loosening too, like a knot I hadn't realized was still tied. About 2 months after Eleanor's offer, something happened I genuinely didn't see coming. One of the small businesses that had partnered with us, donating office supplies and the occasional pizza for our Saturday workshops, was a regional shipping and warehousing company run by a man named Desmond Achibi. He stopped by one afternoon to drop off a box of donated binders and printer paper, and while we were carrying boxes in from his truck, we got to talking. I mentioned my background in logistics, the contract loss, the layoff. His eyebrows went up. He told me his company had just picked up a major new account out of the Hamilton port and was actively trying to build out a coordination team before the contract started in 6 weeks. He asked if I'd be interested in coming in for a conversation. No promises, just a conversation. 3 days later, I sat across a desk from him in an office that smelled like fresh paint, answering questions about contract logistics like I hadn't spent the last several months, convinced nobody wanted what I had to offer. I walked out with a job offer in hand, full-time, benefits, a salary that actually let me breathe. I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward for probably 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive, just holding the offer letter, rereading it like it might change if I looked away too long. The resource center kept going even after I started working full-time at Desmond's company. Eleanor eventually brought on a part-time coordinator to run it day to day, a recently retired guidance counselor named Priscilla. But I still show up most Saturdays, not because I have to, because that building stopped being just a project a long time ago. It became proof of something I didn't fully believe before all this happened, that the worst week of your life can also, somehow, quietly, be the start of the best thing that ever happens to you. Before I get to the end of this, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and one moment of unexpected kindness you've experienced or witnessed yourself. I read every single one, and honestly, some of you have stories that put mine to shame. It's been almost 2 years now since that knock on my door. The Resource Center on Ottawa Street has helped close to 900 people find work, housing referrals, or just somewhere to sit and figure out their next step without judgment. But what still gets me, every time I think about it, isn't the number. It's that none of it would exist if one woman hadn't looked at a struggling tenant about to lose everything, and decided, instead of writing him off, to bet on him. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, send it to someone who could use a reminder that things can turn around when you least expect them to, and subscribe for more stories like this one, because sometimes the week that feels like the absolute end of everything is really just the quiet beginning of some things you couldn't have seen coming.